Are you concerned that your child might have sensory issues? Does your child have tantrums or behavior outbursts? Maybe they show sensitivity to certain clothes, sounds, or smells. Does your child become anxious or frustrated and show noncompliance or avoidance in completing their schoolwork or their writing task? It's really common for parents and school staff to think a child has a behavior or defiance issue when it is not behavior at all. It's a sensory integration disorder. In fact, when the schools try to address these symptoms with behavior intervention, it only makes it worse and will actually cause the student to react even more and escalate in those behaviors because their sensory system is not being regulated properly. It could actually be a sensory processing disorder, parents. And if it is not your bad parenting and it is not the bad behavior of your child. Because many times school districts will try to say that your child has noncompliance or defiance behavior, and they'll try to address it through behavior intervention, which only causes to escalate it. Or they might say, oh, it's bad parenting. I've heard this over the years over and over, blaming it on the parents for a child's bad behavior, which is completely inappropriate and inaccurate because most kids do have a sensory integration disorder. And that's what I'm going to be talking to you today about. And I'm super excited about it because sensory integration is one of my it's a pet peeve of mine. It's a soapbox of mine. And it's a service that I've been advocating for most of my kids, most of my clients over the 23 years that I've been advocating, 24 now. And it's been a huge issue in the educational realm. So please like and share, parents, this video because so many parents don't even understand what sensory integration is, what sensory processing is, that they can get services or therapy for sensory issues for their child, that you could ask for assessment for an occupational therapy assessment. Most parents, even educators, don't know what occupational therapy is and what it really addresses, other than fine motor skills and training in how to hold a pencil and how to write, which is sensory integration is completely beyond that. And really, fine motor is just a finite little piece of what your child can receive through occupational therapy services. And please leave your comments below, parents, because I want to hear from you because I'm going to be doing a 3-part series on sensory integration because it's really a huge subject. I can't possibly give you what you need to know to understand it in a 20-minute Facebook Live. So I'm going to do a 3-part series on this. And today's going to be an introduction and kind of an overview on sensory integration and occupational therapy. And at the end of this live, I'm going to be giving you more information on how you can get more coaching from me or get more information about today's topic about occupational therapy and sensory integration. And I'm going to be calling it SID in my presentation today because instead of saying sensory processing disorder, sensory integration disorder, I'm going to call it SID, which SID, the acronym, what stands for sensory integration disorder. And that's really the proper term to use or the acronym to use for sensory issues for kiddos. So as I said, over the past 24 years, most of my clients have been found eligible for occupational therapy. And I'm going to be telling you why that is today, parents. OT is one of the hardest therapies to receive in public school. And that is because most OTs do not have the training that they need to provide SID therapy and intervention. They have the education and they have the credentials to provide fine motor, and that's what they look when they hear occupational therapy. School-based occupational therapists think in their head, fine motor skills. I'm going to train this kid how to hold a pencil and how to write properly because many of these kids cannot hold a pencil, cannot write properly. They write all over the page. They go up and down. They write small letters, big letters, small letters. They don't stay on the line. And many kids can't even hold a pencil at all. So yes, that is a part of occupational therapy services, but it's a small part of it. But that's all that the OTs in school districts want to do, is fine motor skills. And I'm going to be going over all the other areas that fall under occupational therapy in today's live. So I want to tell you that 69 to 95% of kids on the spectrum have sensory integration disorder and sensory processing deficits. 69 to 95% of kids on the spectrum have sensory integration disorders. Okay, so very important. That's why I immediately ask for an occupational therapy assessment as soon as I take on a case, or if I'm coaching a parent, I coach them to ask for an occupational therapy assessment and what to ask for to include in that testing. Otherwise, they're not even going to test for it. Also, it's not just autism, parents, it's ADHD. Many kids with ADHD have sensory processing issues as well. Kids with learning disabilities have sensory processing issues. So it's a neurological disorder. So if your kid has a neurological disorder, which is finding them eligible for an IEP, most likely they might have issues in sensory integration disorder. Many students are suspended or disciplined for bad behavior because it's a sensory integration disorder. It's not bad behavior. It's because they are reacting to their environment and their sensory systems are overloaded, and so they will react with behaviors that look like bad behaviors. And I'm going to be going over those behaviors right now in 3 points that I'm going to give you, which are what it is, how you can get help. First, what it looks like, what SID looks like, what it is, and how you can get help for your child. So let's talk about what it looks like, parents. So first of all, kids can't modulate their sensory system normally, kids that have SID. So a typical sensory system can modulate normally in different environments. Our body just acclimates to the environment. If it's a bright room, then our eyes acclimate. If it's a noisy room, we can acclimate and still concentrate on hearing a person. If we have something on that's irritating us, or it's kind of itchy, or it's too tight, or if something's bothering, we can still function in the situation that we're in. So I'm going to go a little more deeper into that, but that's what our kids can't do that have sensory integration disorder. They can't. So they act out with behaviors. And those behaviors might look like tantrums, non-compliance, off-task behavior, distractibility, irritability, and difficulty following directions. So there's a reason that these kids have these other kinds of behaviors, which can look like very strange behaviors. Like lots of kiddos with autism, sometimes they have really strange behaviors, but there's a reason why they're having those strange behaviors. It's because they're trying to modulate their sensory systems. There's a reason that their body is saying, I need you to walk up and down and stamp your feet as hard as you can on the ground, because that's going to modulate their sensory system. Or I need you to flap your hands really, really, really hard, really hard, really hard, because that's going to modulate their sensory system. Other strange behaviors can look like moving their eyes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You can see that a lot in kiddos on the spectrum. They might make noises. They might scream at really high-pitched screams. They might hold their ears because they're having auditory sensitivities and it's too loud. They might hit themselves in the head. They might bang their head. They might bang their head. They're seeking sensory input and they're trying to modulate their bodies. They might pace back and forth and just pace and pace and pace and pace because they're trying to modulate their sensory systems. They might talk to themselves repeatedly or repeat things over and over and over and over and over again. And they might have repetitious movements or repetitious vocalizations. So, and these are some of the things that can trigger kiddos and cause them to become overloaded and find their sensory systems unmodulated. And those would look like fluorescent lights just drive them nuts, and they can't even focus, they can't hear directions, they can't engage in curriculum, they can't express or communicate, because those fluorescent lights are like, so impact kiddos, most kids with, and that's why sometimes you can't even go into, a Walmart or a supermarket, or because there's those huge sensory overload visually for those kids with those fluorescent lights. They can even hear, because some of them have very sensitive auditory processing, and they can hear those fluorescent lights, a high-pitched buzzing. Sometimes I can hear it too, but there's a high-pitched, real buzzing that comes with fluorescent lights, which also drives them crazy. Crowded places can trigger behaviors. Clothes and textures can trigger behaviors. Certain smells, certain tastes that they do not like can trigger behaviors. Rooms, very large rooms that echo, really bother their ears. And they are very sensitive to certain sounds and certain noise. So again, it is not a behavior problem. It's a sensory overload for that kiddo. So it is very common for parents and school staff to think this is a behavior defiance issue when it's not. Trying to address these problems with behavior intervention only makes it worse for these kids, and can even make them cause their sensory system to remain dysfunctional. And unless it's addressed, always early based intervention is the best. If you can get your child's sensory integration occupational therapy at a young age, you can actually teach that child's system to modulate yourself, and a lot of these things will go away. It happened with my own daughter. I was able to get her sensory integration therapy, occupational therapy, through the school district. Now, this is back in the 90s, in the mid to late 90s, when they were actually doing this. At that time, we had an actual clinic in our district. It was at they had a big clinic, but it was only one. So my child had to be taken in a van over to the clinic. She went twice a week for an hour. She got 2 hours a week of sensory integration in a clinic at the school site from an occupational therapist that was SIPT certified, which is certified in sensory integration, to provide the proper intervention for her. Then over the years, the district started to say, oh, we're not going to pay for that anymore. We're not going to have clinics in our districts anymore. And they started making the argument that sensory integration was a medical model, and that parents, you need to go to your doctor and have your doctor write a prescription for your child to get occupational therapy in a clinical setting to address sensory integration disorder, which is completely unlawful, because the school districts are mandated to provide sensory integration disorder under occupational therapy. So this has been the battle since the late 90s up till just recently, because they were saying that sensory integration is not evidence-based practices, and therefore the OTs didn't have to address sensory integration disorders, even though they had tons and tons and tons of research that it did. So now I'm going to talk about things that can help your child. Now these are things that you can do at home. These are things that they do in the classroom as well, but this doesn't take the place of good therapy by a credentialed occupational therapist. So those things could look like your child sitting on one of those big, huge therapy balls, which really helps them to organize their sensory system and organize their brains to be able to take in information sitting on one of those therapy balls. Also, a cushion seat one of those cushion seats that a lot of OTs will provide kiddos to sit on. It's kind of like a therapy ball, it does the same thing, but it's not so, obtrusive and not so, kids, oh, why are you sitting on a therapy ball? So sometimes the cushion seats are a little better for not standing out. Deep pressure, to provide deep pressure to the child, because that is going to calm their sensory system. Jumping on a trampoline is amazing for these kids. Swinging, moving their body, just moving their body. They just need to move their body and regulate their system. So any kind of running around the track, even walking, getting out of the classroom and moving their body, that can help just in itself. Weighted blankets, that again provides deep pressure. Weighted vests, a lot of times they're used for little kiddos in grade school. They might like weighted vests, which help them a lot. Deep breathing always helps to calm down any child, even when they're anxious or nervous. Deep breathing is a great way to calm the sensory system. Soft calming music. So a lot of them wear earbuds and listen to soft music. Essential oils and squishy hand toys is used in the classroom as well. But again, you need to get occupational therapy through a trained therapist who is trained in sensory integration disorder, because there's so much more that goes into the actual therapy that provided by an OT, other than those are just little strategies used in the classroom or used at home. That is not therapy through a trained therapist. Okay, now what is sensory integration? It's the ability to interact successfully with the physical environment, to plan, organize, and carry out a sequence of unfamiliar activities to do what one needs and one wants to do. So basically, it's how their bodies interact with the environment in a unfamiliar activity or an unfamiliar environment. So that's why a lot of times you see our kids get really super anxious when something changes, or they're going to a new place that they've never been before, or meeting a new person they've never met before, or they have something that's unfamiliar. They will escalate in anxiety because they're going to have to modulate their sensory system to get used to this new situation, new person, new environment, whatever it is, unfamiliar. That makes them anxious. And because their sensory systems don't immediately just boom, go into effect, and they can easily just transition and be successful in that situation. Our kids can't do that. So that's really what occupational therapy sensory integration really, or praxis, is. So kids with SID can have sensory sensitivities, and some seek sensory input. So they either seek it out because they have low sensory processing. So the five senses, there's a sensory processing, so they might seek it out because they want that input because their senses are low, working at a low rate, and which is hypo. It's called hyposensitivity, or it's hypersensitivities, which means they are heightened. Their senses are heightened to a hyper state where they are sensitive with their five senses. So, and they could be hyper with their auditory, very sensitive with their auditory, but then they might be seeking deep pressure input. So it can go back and forth. It's not like across the board they're hyper or across the board they're hypo. It can fluctuate and vacillate with each sense. Kids with SID can have sensory sensitivities in planning, problem solving, and carrying out a task. So they have deficits in those areas: planning, problem solving, and carrying out a task, which also falls under executive functioning skills. So all those, and executive functioning does fall under occupational therapy services. They have poor organization of self in the environment. They can't organize in their environment. They have problems with their gross motor skills. They have problems with fine motor skills. handwriting difficulties, aversion to writing tasks. It affects their five senses, as I mentioned. They could have tactile defensiveness and sensitivity to clothes and to any kind of touch. They might be very sensitive to touch, or they might actually seek deep pressure touch. They can have low tone in their solar plexus and their mid torso. They can have light sensitivity to light. They can have sound sensitivity. They can have sensitivity to smell, or they can seek smell. So a lot of kids go around smelling everything because they're seeking that sensory input through their smelling sense. Okay, so and that's why also the deep pressure, you see a lot of kids, which is a huge red flag, those kiddos that are sitting at their desk and they're always laying on their desk and just pushing their body into their desk, or laying on their desk, or they're always laying over their chair. They're leaning on something all the time. They're leaning on the wall. They're leaning on their neighbor or their peer. They want to sit and lay on their therapist. Those kids are seeking deep pressure input. Okay, so how can you help them? How can we help our kiddos? So there's a problem with the schools and IEPs. Number one, that's the problem, is that, you know, when you bring this up to your occupational therapist, she's going to say, oh yeah, I tested for that in your assessment, OT assessment, and I didn't see any sensory integration issues or sensory processing issues. I didn't see any. This is like 99% of OTs are going to say that, because guess what? They probably didn't test for sensory integration. So when you ask for an OT, occupational therapy assessment, you must say, I am requesting that the OT assessment include sensory integration, all areas of sensory integration testing as well. And that must be in written form, of course, everything in writing. If it wasn't written, it never happened. So you must ask for sensory integration to be included in the occupational therapy assessment, or they won't even test for it, parents. They won't even test for it. So the other thing is, even teachers and even occupational therapists, when you say sensory integration disorder or SIPT certified, a lot of teachers don't know what that is. Teachers don't understand sensory integration. They understand because everybody has in their head that OT, it means that the therapist works with the child on their fine motor skills and writing. And it's so not true. So unless parents have this information to know what to ask for and how to get it, you're never going to get it through your school system. They're never going to offer it. OTs are never going to identify it and provide the specialized, it's a very specialized therapy through the occupational therapist. And I'm going to get into a little bit of that today. I can just give like an overview, and I'm going to go deeper into my series. This is part 1, and then it'll be part 2 and part 3, where I can break some of this down further. So again, request your occupational therapy assessment, include sensory integration in your assessment request. And then parents, this is so typical, and it's with any assessment. The district assessment is going to come back, even if she did include some sensory integration testing. And she's never going to recommend that your child needs 3 times a week of a half hour of sensory integration in a specialized therapy room. That's never going to come from a district OT. You have to get it through an IEE, an individual independent educational evaluation, IEE. Independent educational evaluation. That is from a private OT outside of your school district. Then and you got to look for one that specializes in sensory integration disorder. And then you're going to receive the correct recommendations for goals, accommodations, and services. Okay. And parents, if you are, because I've heard a lot of parents that see these deficits in their child and say, my kid has sensory sensitivities. And what is that? I don't understand, but they have these behaviors, and I know they're having sensitivities to certain things. And they might not even have an IEP. They might be on a 504 or not. So if that's the case, parents, and you're one of those parents that think your child has sensory integration dysfunction and isn't even on an IEP or a 504, well, then you have to go through the eligibility process, which means you have to ask first for a psychoeducational assessment in order to be found eligible for an IEP. And then you're going to ask for an occupational therapy assessment to include sensory integration. Okay. So I want to talk about over the past 15 years, I've been working with Dr. Suzanne Smith-Rowley. She's a world-renowned occupational therapist. She writes the protocols for the American Academy of Occupational Therapists, for the American Academy of Pediatrics. She's written articles and been published in everything that has to do with occupational therapy. She's traveled the world teaching sensory integration and certifying occupational therapists in sensory integration. And she did a systematic review of AIRS sensory integration intervention for children with autism, a big report that goes into that sensory integration is an evidence-based practice that school districts must view as a valid intervention through the school district. Because as I said, it's been a battle since the 90s up until just recently, when most states have found sensory integration to be an evidence-based practice. But it doesn't matter really, because OTs haven't caught up to that, and OTs will still argue and fight not to provide sensory integration in the school setting, because they still will go back to that same old argument saying that, oh, that's a medical model. If you want that, that's a clinical model. You need to go to your doctor, and that's outside the school. We don't do clinical, we provide fine motor intervention. Incorrect, inaccurate, not true. So they're going to say that, and you need to be prepared to say, I'm sorry, no, but it is an evidence-based practice. And the IDEA does say that sensory integration is mandated for school districts to provide intervention in those areas. So if you look up Jean Ayres back in 1972, she's the original person who actually came up with the theory of sensory integration disorder, or SID. And so it was way back in 1972 that this started coming into play, and they started developing these whole theory of sensory integration, as well as trying to have school districts view it as a evidence-based practice, which now it is. Now it is. Thanks to Dr. Suzanne Smith-Rowley and all of her cohorts. She's like my hero, because I've worked with her in hundreds of IEP meetings, having her do my IEEs for my kiddos, and being successful in having my clients receive sensory integration disorder interventions by a certified occupational therapist. It is possible, parents. It is possible. So, parents, it's so important for you to start learning this information about sensory integration, because like I said, most kids on an IEP probably have some type of deficits in their sensory integration or sensory processing. So, and if it's only addressed through behavior, like behavior goals, then it's not going to meet the needs of the child. That behavior isn't going to go away, because their system isn't modulated. So it has to do with the neurological deficits in their sensory system, and it's not going to be addressed through just behavior goals or a psychologist or a behavioralist. So it's a huge, big hole in our kids' IEPs and in our kids' programs. And this is the missing link, really, sensory integration. And like I said, school districts aren't helping to address that problem. which is why a lot of kids' behavior never gets better because their sensory needs aren't being addressed. And a lot of times kids have to be placed in other environments, other placements, because they're having behaviors in a general ed class that are disrupting the teacher's teaching and the other students' learning. So this is huge to learn about sensory integration, parents. So I look forward to doing my part 2 with you next Monday. And I'm Valerie Abrahamian, the IEP Navigator, and I assist, coach, and empower parents to receive the IEP their child needs to thrive both in school and in life after high school. And I look forward to seeing you all next Monday at 10 o'clock Pacific time for my next Advocates for Angels Facebook Live. God bless everyone. Take care.